The world changed on February 28th, and most Americans are only now beginning to understand the true weight of what happened. A 21-mile stretch of water, narrower than some American counties, is sitting at the center of the biggest global energy crisis since the 1970s, and the question being asked in Tokyo right now, in Brussels, in Beijing, and in every major capital on Earth is not whether they care. It's whether they're willing to pay the price of standing beside a Washington that launched this war and is now looking around asking where everybody went. Trump called on countries including China, France, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and others to send warships to the Strait of Hormuz, arguing that the nations most affected by the closure should step up and send military vessels to secure the waterway. And he singled out Japan. He posted on social media. He made calls. He sent signals. And then he walked into the most consequential week Japan has had in its post-war history, with Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi on her way to Washington for a meeting that was already going to be tense and just became something far more dangerous for her politically and constitutionally. Takaichi herself warned that she was facing an extremely difficult meeting with Trump after the president criticized Japan for rebuffing his demand for warships to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. That is a Japanese prime minister standing before her own parliament, telling her own people that the meeting with the most powerful man in the world is going to be extremely difficult. That tells you everything you need to know about the corner Washington has painted itself into, and the corner it is now trying to paint its allies into as well. Now let's step back and look at this clearly, because what is happening right now is not just a shipping dispute. It is not just an oil price spike. What we are watching is the unraveling of the post-World War II alliance architecture in real time, and the Strait of Hormuz is simply where the cracks are showing most visibly. The United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran on February 28th of this year. Those strikes targeted military facilities, nuclear sites, and leadership, and resulted in the death of Iran's supreme leader. In response, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps officially confirmed on March 2nd that the strait was closed, threatening any ship that attempted to pass through it. Think about the audacity of that moment. Think about what it takes for a nation already under the most intense military pressure it has experienced in modern history to respond by locking down one of the most critical arteries of global commerce. Iran did not flinch. They closed the door and handed the world a bill. Tanker traffic dropped by approximately 70%, with over 150 ships anchoring outside the strait to avoid the risk of attack. As of mid-March, Iran had confirmed 21 attacks on merchant ships. And when you understand what flows through that strait, not just oil, but liquefied natural gas, fertilizers, aluminum, petrochemical inputs, pharmaceuticals, you start to understand why this is not a regional problem. This is a global problem. Fertilizer alone represents one of the biggest downstream risks, with roughly 1/3 of global fertilizer trade transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Prices for urea at the New Orleans fertilizer hub have already risen from $475 per metric ton to $680 per metric ton. And that is not great timing for the planting window in the American Midwest for soy and corn. You want to talk about kitchen table issues? Your grocery bill is connected to a 21-mile strait in the Persian Gulf, and that connection is not theoretical anymore. It is playing out right now. Brent crude surpassed $100 per barrel on March 8th for the first time in 4 years, rising to as high as $126 per barrel at its peak. The closure has been described as the largest disruption to energy supply since the 1970s energy crisis, and the largest in the history of the global oil market. Let that sink in. Not the largest in recent memory, the largest in the entire recorded history of the global oil market. And we are only 3 weeks into this conflict. Now, here is where the Japan situation becomes particularly revealing. Roughly 70% of Japan's oil imports transit the Strait of Hormuz. Some analysts put that number even higher for certain categories of energy imports. Japan is not a peripheral actor in this crisis. It is one of the most exposed economies on the planet. And yet when Washington came calling and asked Tokyo to put warships in the water, the answer from Prime Minister Takaichi was measured, careful, and ultimately resistant. She told the Upper House Budget Committee that no decision had been made regarding the dispatch of escort vessels, and that Tokyo was examining what Japan can do independently and what is possible within the legal framework. That phrase, within the legal framework, is doing enormous political work right now because Japan has a constitution, Article 9 of that Constitution, written in the aftermath of World War II, renounces war as a sovereign right of the nation and prohibits the maintenance of war potential. Now, Japan has stretched that interpretation considerably over the decades. It has a self-defense force. It has been building military capacity at a rate that would have been unthinkable to an earlier generation of Japanese lawmakers. But there is still a meaningful legal and political line between defending Japanese territory and projecting Japanese military force into the Middle East to escort oil tankers through a war zone that Washington and Tel Aviv created. Japan's defense minister Shinjiro Koizumi said in Parliament that what is most important is to put efforts, including diplomatic efforts, into calming the situation. That is not the language of a nation preparing to send its navy into a combat zone at America's request. That is the language of a nation trying to find a way to tell a very powerful and very unpredictable American president that the answer is no, without saying the word no in a way that destroys the relationship or triggers economic retaliation. Trump warned in an interview that it will be very bad for the future of NATO if countries fail to police the strait. He also said aboard Air Force One, "I'm demanding that these countries come in and protect their own territory because it is their own territory." And he added, "Whether we get support or not, I can say this, we will remember, we will remember." Those three words carry a threat that every government in the world heard clearly. This is the language of transactional power. This is not alliance management. This is not coalition building in the traditional sense. This is leverage. This is Washington saying, we went to war, we created this crisis, and now we expect you to help us manage the consequences, and if you don't, there will be a price to pay. That price could be tariffs. It could be reduced intelligence sharing. It could be a colder shoulder in bilateral negotiations. It could be any number of things that a country like Japan, deeply integrated with the American economy and dependent on the American security umbrella for its defense against China and North Korea, cannot easily absorb. Analysts have noted that Takaichi caught a partial break when Trump appeared to back away somewhat from his demand for Japan to send warships. But the incident highlighted the challenges she faces as she tries to nudge Japan away from its pacifist post-war stance toward a more robust military doctrine. The key word in that sentence is nudge. Japan has been nudging. It has been increasing defense spending. It has been quietly building capabilities. But nudging is a far cry from dispatching destroyers to the Persian Gulf in the middle of a shooting war. One expert described Trump's request as being like asking the sacred sumo wrestlers to play American football. That is a colorful way of saying what a lot of serious analysts are thinking. The United States is asking Japan to do something that is fundamentally incompatible with Japan's political identity, its legal structure, and its domestic public opinion, and doing so under conditions of maximum pressure at the worst possible moment with a deadline attached. Meanwhile, Japan is not alone in its reluctance. Germany's foreign minister said he does not see a role for NATO in addressing the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, stating that NATO has made no decision in this direction and could not assume responsibility for the strait. Australia said it has not been asked to join a naval coalition and ruled out sending ships to do so. The coalition that Washington is trying to assemble is, at this moment, conspicuously thin. The nations most dependent on Hormuz oil, Japan, South Korea, India, China, are each calculating their own exposure and their own political constraints, and none of them are rushing to the front of the line. China's response is particularly worth noting. China's foreign ministry said they are in contact with all sides of the conflict about the situation in the Strait of Hormuz, committed to promoting the easing and cooling down of the situation. That is the language of a nation that sees an opportunity in this crisis rather than an obligation. China can sit back, watch the American-built order fracture, watch oil prices punish Western economies, and position itself as the responsible adult in the room calling for diplomacy, all while its own ships quietly negotiate transit permissions with Tehran. Iran has signaled that it would keep the Strait of Hormuz closed only to ships from the United States, Israel, and their Western allies. Turkish ships were approved for transit. Indian-flagged gas carriers and a Saudi oil tanker were also allowed to pass. So what Iran is doing is not a blanket closure. It is a targeted, strategic, politically calibrated blockade, one that is designed to maximize pain for Washington and its closest partners while leaving enough daylight for non-aligned nations to keep trading. That is sophisticated statecraft from a country under an unprecedented military assault. And Washington seems genuinely surprised by the resilience and the strategic coherence of Iran's response. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on all LNG shipments on March 4th after Iranian attacks on its Ras Laffan facilities. That single event removed 20% of global LNG supply from the market overnight. 20% of global LNG supply gone overnight, not reduced, not temporarily disrupted. Gone with a force majeure declaration that tells the entire market that Qatar itself does not know when or how it will resume shipments. The downstream effects of that single event will ripple through European energy markets, Asian economies, and American industry for months. The International Energy Agency took the unprecedented step of announcing the release of 400 million barrels of oil from strategic reserves. That is not a routine measure. That is an emergency measure. That is the global energy system's equivalent of a defibrillator, a shock to the system designed to buy time while a longer-term solution is found. But releasing strategic reserves does not reopen the strait. It does not stop Iranian drones from hitting tankers. It does not restore shipping insurance, which is the invisible mechanism that actually determines whether ships move. Protection and indemnity insurance, critical for shipping, had its war risk removed from March 5th, making the economic risk too high for ship owners to use the strait, even independently of the physical danger. The insurance system is the real lever here. You can tell a ship captain to sail through the strait. But if there is no insurance, the ship owner will not let that captain go anywhere near it. And if the ship owner will not move, no amount of political pressure from Washington changes the arithmetic. The market has already made its decision about the Strait of Hormuz. The only thing that changes that decision is either military force sufficient to compel Iran to reopen the strait, or a diplomatic resolution that gives Iran enough to walk back its closure without looking like it's surrendered. The White House has been weighing the possibility of seizing Iran's key oil export terminal on Karg Island if tanker traffic remains restricted in the Persian Gulf. Think about what that means. We are talking about the United States potentially seizing a sovereign nation's oil infrastructure in the middle of an active conflict, not as a side effect of military operations, but as a deliberate economic weapon. The escalation ladder here has no obvious top rung, and that is what the Takaichi situation ultimately reflects. Japan is looking at the trajectory of this conflict, the strikes, the closure, the insurance collapse, the drone attacks on Gulf ports, the potential seizure of Karg Island, and asking a very reasonable question: where does this end? Takaichi herself told Parliament that she will clearly inform President Trump what Japan can and cannot do under Japanese law. That is a head of government drawing a line, politely, diplomatically, but drawing it nonetheless. The United States went into this war without a clear exit ramp. It achieved significant military objectives, striking Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure, removing Iran's supreme leader, but it did not account for the possibility that Iran would respond not by collapsing, but by closing a door that controls 20% of the world's oil. And now Washington is discovering something that every student of geopolitics understands. Military dominance does not automatically translate into strategic control. You can win every battle in the air and still lose the economic war on the water. The allies that Washington counted on, Japan, the Europeans, the Gulf states, are each running their own calculations. They are each measuring what they owe America against what this war is costing them. And so far, the ledger is not coming out in Washington's favor. The pressure on Takaichi is not just pressure on Japan. It is a test of the entire post-1945 alliance systems. And the answers coming back from Tokyo, Berlin, Canberra, and Brussels suggest that the system is under a strain it has not felt in a very long time. What happens in that White House meeting on Thursday, and what Takaichi says yes or no to, will matter well beyond the Persian Gulf.